You've probably scrolled past 3 headlines today that made your stomach tighten, and you didn't even register it happening. That's not a flaw in you, that's just what it feels like to be a person paying attention to the world in 2026. And somewhere underneath that low, constant hum of unease, there's a question you may not have said out loud, even to yourself. Is this normal? Or is this something else? Here's the first scene, and maybe it's yours. You're lying in bed, phone still warm in your hand, having just read about another conflict somewhere, another headline that used the word unprecedented, like it's a normal word now. You put the phone down, you stare at the ceiling, and something in your chest doesn't settle, even after you close your eyes. Here's the second scene. Maybe it's not the news at all. Maybe you're sitting in church, or reading your Bible at your kitchen table, and you land on Matthew 24. Wars, famines, earthquakes. And instead of comfort, you feel your pulse pick up a little. Because it sounds less like ancient prophecy, and more like this morning's newspaper. I want to tell you something before we go one sentence further into this. This video is not going to tell you the end is near in any way you can circle on a calendar. It's not going to point at a headline and say, there it is. What it is going to do is slow down and look closely at 3 words in the original Greek of Matthew 24. Words most English Bibles translate so smoothly, you'd never guess what's actually sitting underneath them. And I think once you see what Jesus actually said, this passage is going to feel less like a warning designed to frighten you, and more like something else entirely. Stay with me. There's a detail in verse 8 that changes how the whole passage should be read, and almost nobody stops long enough to notice it. Let's set the scene properly, because it matters more than most retellings give it credit for. Jesus has just left the temple in Jerusalem, and his disciples, walking with him, point out the magnificence of the building, the massive stones, the gleaming architecture that had taken generations to construct. And Jesus responds with something that must have landed like a physical blow. Not one stone would be left on another. Later, sitting privately with him on the Mount of Olives, looking out over the very city they'd just left, his disciples ask him 3 questions. When will these things happen? What will be the sign of his coming? And what will be the sign of the end of the age? What Jesus says next in response is the most detailed teaching he ever gave about what's coming. And here's the central question this video is built to answer. What did Jesus say would happen first, and why does he frame it in a way that most readers, reading quickly, reading in translation, reading with 2026 anxiety already sitting in their chest, tend to miss entirely? Because here's the tension. Most people read Matthew 24, 6-8 and hear a list of terrifying events. Wars, rumors of wars, famines, earthquakes, and it's easy to stop there, to read it as chaos, a sign that the world is unraveling. But there's a supporting passage worth holding in your mind as we go, one that raises the stakes without resolving anything yet. Paul writes to the Thessalonians, in 1 Thessalonians 5:3, that when they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them, as labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they shall not escape. Paul uses the exact same image Jesus used. That's not a coincidence. And we're going to come back to why that specific image, chosen twice by 2 different New Testament writers, matters more than almost any other detail in this whole passage. Short sentence now, because it deserves its own breath. The image was chosen on purpose. Here's what should be nagging at you a little, if you've read Matthew 24 before, and always felt vaguely unsettled by it. Because if Jesus wanted to describe pure chaos, meaningless suffering with no direction, no structure, no point, he had plenty of Greek words available to him that would have said exactly that. He didn't reach for one of those words. He reached for a very specific, very deliberate image instead. One, his first listeners, all of them Jewish, would have instantly recognized from centuries of their own tradition. And once you understand what that image actually communicates, I think verse 8 is going to sound completely different in your ears. So here's where we're headed. We're going to look at the actual Greek word Jesus used for what gets translated sorrows in English. And then we're going to look at the specific instruction Jesus gives right in the middle of describing all of this. A command most readers skim right past on their way to the scarier parts. When you put those 2 things together, I think this passage stops sounding like a warning meant to frighten you, and starts sounding like something closer to a promise. Let's read the full passage, because it's worth hearing exactly as Jesus said it. Matthew 24, verses 6-8, in the New King James Version. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. And see that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Here's the original language insight that reframes the entire passage. The Greek word translated sorrows is Odin. According to Strong's Concordance and standard Greek lexicons, Odin doesn't mean generic suffering or random pain. Its primary, plain meaning is the pain of childbirth, travail pain, birth pangs specifically. And Thayer's Greek lexicon notes something remarkable about how this word was already being used before Jesus ever spoke it. It was the standard term for the calamities Jewish tradition believed would come before the Messiah's arrival, what rabbinic sources called the birth pains of the Messiah, Shevle Mashiach, in Hebrew. Here's what that phrase meant to the very people sitting on that hillside with Jesus. This wasn't a new idea he was introducing to confused disciples. It was a familiar concept from their own religious tradition, and Jesus was deliberately reaching for it. When a first-century Jewish listener heard the word Odin used about approaching calamity, they weren't hearing random disaster. They were hearing a specific, structured idea their whole religious culture already understood. Something is being born. The suffering isn't the point. The suffering is what precedes an arrival. And here's a detail from the historical record that makes this even more vivid. The Olivet Discourse, as this teaching is known, was delivered only decades before the Roman legions under Titus would in fact leave not one stone of that temple standing on another. A fulfillment so specific and so historically documented that even secular historians of the period, writing independently of any Christian source, describe the temple's total destruction in 70 AD in detail. Jesus wasn't speaking in vague, symbolic terms to people who couldn't picture what he meant. He was speaking to people who would, within a single generation, watch the exact building behind him reduced to rubble exactly as he said. Now here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you, the one almost no teaching on this passage stops to highlight. Go back to verse 6 itself. See that you are not troubled. The Greek word behind troubled is throeo, and according to Strong's Concordance and multiple Greek grammar resources, it's an unusual word for Jesus to use. It more commonly means to cry out, to scare, or to terrify oneself. And grammatically, scholars note this verb is used here in a form where the disciples would, in effect, be doing this to themselves, working themselves into alarm, rather than simply being alarmed by outside events. Jesus isn't just saying, "Don't worry." He's specifically warning them against a particular kind of self-generated panic, the spiral you fall into when you keep refreshing the news and let your own imagination finish the terrifying sentence the headline started. This is where the first curiosity loop we opened at the start of this video finally closes. Remember the two scenes I described? Lying awake with your phone still warm in your hand, or feeling your pulse rise reading Matthew 24 at your kitchen table? Both of those moments are, in a very real sense, throeo, the self-generated alarm Jesus specifically told his disciples to guard against. Not because the events aren't real, he says plainly. These things must come to pass. The Greek word here is dei, a term grammarians consistently note indicates necessity, not accident, not surprise, but something falling within a larger ordered plan. The events are real. The panic is optional. And here's a second historical detail worth holding alongside the first, because it deepens just how immediate this teaching would have felt to its original hearers. The Mount of Olives itself, where Jesus sat to deliver this entire teaching, held its own layered significance for a Jewish audience. It's the same ridge the prophet Zechariah names as the place where the Lord's feet would one day stand, and it directly overlooks both the Kidron Valley and the Temple Mount Jesus had just finished describing. His disciples weren't hearing an abstract lecture in a classroom. They were sitting on a hillside, soaked in centuries of their own prophetic memory, watching the very building they'd just admired, glinting in the afternoon sun, while Jesus told them, calmly and specifically, that it would not survive. Every phrase he used that day was anchored to a physical place they could see with their own eyes. This pattern doesn't stand alone in Matthew 24. It connects to a thread that runs through both testaments. Isaiah uses the same birth pains imagery centuries earlier, in Isaiah 26:17, describing Israel's anguish before deliverance, as a woman with child is in pain and cries out in her pangs when she draws near the time of her delivery. The prophet Jeremiah uses nearly identical language in Jeremiah 36, asking why he sees every man's hands on his loins, like a woman in labor. And then Paul, writing to a frightened, persecuted church in Thessalonica, just decades after Jesus spoke these words on the Mount of Olives, reaches for that exact same image again in 1 Thessalonians 5:3. 4 different biblical writers, across roughly 7 centuries, all describing history's hardest moments, using the identical image: never chaos, always labor. God was saying the same structural truth to people living through wildly different crises. What feels like unraveling is, in his accounting, a process moving toward an arrival. Here's a verified, documented human reality worth sitting with, because this passage was never meant to stay abstract. According to the 2026 Global Peace Index, released by the Institute for Economics and Peace this year, the number of countries engaged in external conflict has nearly doubled since 2008, and researchers at Uppsala University's Conflict Data Program recorded the highest number of state-based conflicts since the end of the Second World War: 65 active conflicts in 2025 alone, including wars that most of us watched unfold in real time on our phones. This isn't a video built on speculation. If the world has felt louder and more unstable to you lately, the documented data agrees with your instinct. Here's what Jesus describes happening next in this same passage, and it moves the signs from something global into something painfully personal. Matthew 24:9-10 describes persecution, being delivered up, afflicted, hated, for my name's sake, and then something even sharper. Many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Not persecution from a distant, hostile system, betrayal from within, from people who once stood beside you. Luke's account of this same teaching makes it even more specific. Luke 21:16 says believers will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, relatives and friends. And Jesus makes nearly the same point elsewhere in Matthew 10:36, that a man's enemies will be those of his own household. For many believers throughout history, and for many believers living under real pressure for their faith right now, that particular kind of loneliness, the friend who quietly distances themselves, the family member who chooses comfort over solidarity, has proven harder to carry than outright hostility from strangers. You may be carrying something right now that has nothing to do with global politics at all, a relationship that fractured over something you believe, a quiet distance that opened up with someone you used to be close to. If that's you, I want you to know this passage was written with exactly that kind of pain in view, not just headline-scale disaster. Jesus named it specifically 2,000 years ago because he knew it would be one of the harder parts of this pattern to carry. This same thread of relational fracture runs even further back than Matthew 24. The Old Testament prophet Micah, writing centuries before Jesus, describes a nearly identical breakdown in Micah 7:6. A man's enemies are the men of his own household. Words Jesus himself quotes almost word for word in Matthew 10:36. That's not a coincidence of language. It's Jesus deliberately reaching back into his own scriptures to show his disciples that this particular kind of pain, betrayal from those closest to you, has always been part of the pattern faithful people walk through in hard seasons, long before any of them were born. Here's the second curiosity loop, and it's the one that carries us into the heart of this whole video. Because if the pattern Jesus describes truly behaves like labor, not random, but structured, purposeful, moving toward something, then what exactly is it moving toward? What is being born? That's the question the next section finally answers. I need to say something to you directly here, because I think it's the reason you've stayed with this video this long. If you've ever felt like the weight of what's happening in the world right now is somehow personal, like it's landing specifically on your shoulders, your sleep, your peace, I don't think that feeling is irrational. I think it's evidence you're paying attention to something real. But I don't think it's the whole picture Jesus gave his disciples that day on the hillside. Here is the deepest insight this entire video has been building toward. Birth pains, unlike random suffering, have 3 specific qualities, and every single one of them is present in how Jesus structures this passage. First, they escalate, each contraction more intense than the one before, never staying at a flat, constant level. Second, and this is the detail scholars of this passage consistently note, the intervals compress. Early labor might space contractions 20 minutes apart. Near delivery, they come in a rush, one after another. And third, this is the one that should land the hardest. Birth pains exist for a reason. A woman in labor isn't suffering pointlessly. The pain is doing something. It's delivering a life into the world. Sit with that for a moment, because it deserves room to breathe. Jesus did not choose that image accidentally, and he didn't choose it to terrify his disciples into fear. He chose it because it's the one image in the ancient world that communicates painful, intensifying, converging events that are nevertheless moving towards something good, something worth all of it. New life, not destruction. If Jesus had wanted his disciples to hear, "Everything is falling apart with no point," he had other words available. He reached instead for the one image that says, "This hurts, and it is going somewhere." Here's what changes when this actually settles into you. It changes how you're allowed to read the news. It doesn't mean pretending the conflict data isn't real, or that the world isn't genuinely harder and louder than it used to be. The documented statistics we looked at earlier are true, and Jesus never asked his followers to deny reality. But it means you're permitted to hold that reality inside a bigger frame than panic. The contractions are real. The chaos you feel isn't imaginary. But according to Jesus' own chosen image, it's not directionless. It's laboring toward an arrival he himself will bring. Here is the sentence worth carrying with you, worth sharing with someone you love who needs to hear it today. The pain in the world right now is not proof that everything is falling apart. According to Jesus' own words, it may be proof that something is being delivered. Let's bring this fully into your actual life this week, because none of this is meant to stay theoretical. If you've noticed your own private version of Throw-Yo lately, that self-generated spiral where one headline leads your imagination somewhere darker than the headline itself actually said, I want to offer you something practical, drawn straight from this passage. Jesus' instruction wasn't ignore the world or stop paying attention. It was far more specific. Notice what's happening and refuse to add panic on top of it yourself. That's a skill, not just a feeling, and it's one you can actually practice this week. Closing the news a little earlier, naming the anxious spiral out loud when you feel it starting, bringing it to God in prayer instead of carrying it alone in the dark. I want to speak to you plainly for a moment, because I think you needed to hear this today. Whatever specific fear brought you to this video, a headline, a family fracture, a private ache about where the world seems to be heading, Jesus addressed that fear directly, by name, 2,000 years ago, and he didn't tell you to pretend it away. He told you it has a direction. He told you the pain is not the destination. Let me pray something over you now, if you'll let me. Lord, for everyone listening tonight who feels the weight of this world pressing down harder than usual, the headlines, the conflicts, the quiet fractures in relationships that used to feel solid, I ask you to settle something real in their hearts right now. Not a false calm that ignores what's true, but your own peace, the kind that holds steady even while the news stays hard. Help each person here to recognize the difference between the real weight of the world and the extra weight they've been carrying alone in their own mind. Remind them that you named this pattern in advance, on purpose, so that none of it would catch them by surprise or leave them without hope. For anyone who has felt betrayed or distanced by someone they loved because of their faith, comfort them tonight in a way only you can, and give every person hearing this the quiet confidence that whatever labor this world is moving through, you are the one who receives what is finally delivered. In your name, amen. Here is the sentence I want you to carry into tomorrow morning. The world may feel like it's coming apart, but according to the very words Jesus chose, it may actually be coming towards something, and he already told you not to be afraid of the process. Let's land this in 3 things you can actually carry into this week. First, practice noticing Throw-Yo in yourself. That specific, self-generated spiral where a real headline gets amplified by your own imagination into something even darker than what actually happened. Jesus' instruction wasn't to stop noticing the world, it was to stop scaring yourself on top of what's already real. Second, remember that the events Jesus describes are called dei, necessary, not accidental, which means the instability you're watching unfold is not evidence that God has lost control of the story. It's evidence the story is unfolding according to a pattern he named in advance. Third, hold on to the image itself. Birth pains are not meaningless. They escalate, they compress, and they end in an arrival worth everything that came before it. Whatever hard season you're standing in personally, or watching unfold globally, that same structure holds. If any part of this landed for you tonight, I'd love to hear it. Drop a comment and tell me which of these 3 truths hit you hardest. Or if you're carrying something heavier than what we talked about today, leave it as a prayer request, and I mean this sincerely. I will be praying over every single one I read this week. If this video helped steady something in you tonight, take a moment and tap that like button. It genuinely helps careful, unhurried teaching like this reach more people who need exactly this kind of steadiness, instead of the fear-driven content this topic usually attracts. And if you'd like to keep walking through Scripture together like this, I'd love to have you stay. Hit subscribe and become part of a small, growing community of people who'd rather understand these passages clearly than be frightened by them. We're building something here I think your faith actually needs. Wherever you are tonight, whatever headline or private ache brought you to this video, you are not forgotten, and you are not required to carry this alone. The same Jesus who sat on that hillside and named every hard thing that was coming also promised his followers he would be with them through every single bit of it. Keep your eyes fixed on the one who already told you how this labor ends. Rest tonight in his peace. Good night, and may that peace hold you until morning.